Picture a world where the clothes you wear could land you in jail, where a simple sneeze at the wrong moment might cost you your freedom, and where the rules of daily life were so bizarre they'd make even the most imaginative storyteller pause. This wasn't some twisted fantasy. It was the reality of the Middle Ages, a time when laws weren't just about keeping order, but about enforcing the strangest, most unexpected rules you could imagine. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on 20 of the most jaw-dropping, head-scratching laws from medieval times. These weren't just quirks of history. They were powerful tools that shaped societies, controlled behavior, and sometimes even decided who thrived and who didn't survive. What kind of world demanded that peasants wear specific colors to show their status, or banned women from carrying certain items in public? How did a society function when something as innocent as playing the wrong game could lead to severe punishment? The answers reveal more than just odd legal codes. They expose the fears, priorities, and sometimes the sheer absurdity of medieval life. From laws that targeted the way people dressed to rules that dictated how they could mourn the dead, these regulations were more than just curiosities. They were windows into a world where control was often exercised in the most unexpected ways. So why did these laws exist, and what can they teach us about the people who lived under them? As we journey through these 20 bizarre rules, you'll discover how deeply they influenced everything from social hierarchies to personal freedoms. Some were born out of superstition, others from the whims of those in power, and a few might even make you wonder how anyone thought they were a good idea. By the time we're done, you'll see the Middle Ages in a whole new light, not just as a time of knights and castles, but as an era where the law could be as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. Ready to step into this strange legal labyrinth? Let's begin. Imagine being told that the simple act of picking up a fork could damn your soul. That was the reality in 11th century Italy, where the church declared forks not just unnecessary but downright sinful. Church leaders claimed these tiny, two-pronged utensils symbolized arrogance and decadence, a direct affront to God's design. After all, if the Almighty had intended humans to eat with forks, wouldn't He have given us claws? Instead, people were expected to use their hands the way nature intended. But here's where it gets even stranger. Noble families, particularly in Venice, loved their forks. They saw them as elegant status symbols, a way to distance themselves from the messy, finger food habits of the lower classes. This clash of beliefs led to dramatic showdowns. One noblewoman who dared to eat with a fork at a public feast was publicly scolded by a priest, who declared her vanity would bring divine punishment. Some accounts even say she died shortly after proof, according to the Church, of God's wrath. So how did society function without forks? For most, it meant embracing the mess. Bread often doubled as a plate, with thick slices soaking up sauces and acting as edible napkins. Stews and porridges were slurped straight from communal bowls. And if you were wealthy, you'd have servants to pour scented water over your hands between courses. The fork ban wasn't just about table manners, it was about control. By dictating something as personal as how you ate, the church reinforced its authority over daily life. But like many strange laws, this one eventually crumbled. By the Renaissance, forks trickled back into fashion, thanks to Italian nobility's persistence and the growing influence of trade with cultures that had long embraced them. What started as a scandal became a staple, proving that even the most rigid rules can't stop progress or a good meal. Try to hold in that sneeze, because in medieval England, letting one out during church could cost you more than just a few dirty looks. Authorities believed a sneeze wasn't just a reflex, it was your body expelling evil spirits, and doing so in the middle of a holy service was like unleashing chaos into a sacred space. Imagine the pressure, sitting through a long sermon, your nose tingling, desperately trying to stifle the urge while knowing that a chew, might land you a hefty fine or worse, a public penance. Some churches even stationed monks near congregants known for weak sinuses, ready to scold or drag offenders outside before their sneezes could pollute the sanctity of the Mass. This wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was a window into how deeply superstition and religion intertwined. Medieval people saw the body as a battleground between divine and demonic forces, where even involuntary actions carried spiritual weight. A cough might be forgiven, but a sneeze, that was suspect. In some regions, sneezing was thought to momentarily open a doorway for demons to enter, which made churches particularly sensitive. And while nobles might escape with a warning, peasants faced humiliating punishments, like standing outside the church doors for weeks or donating precious food to the clergy as compensation for their disruption. Yet the irony is hard to miss. The same cultures that feared sneezes also blessed people after them, with phrases like "God bless you," originating as protection against those escaping spirits. It's a contradiction that shows how medieval minds wrestled with the unknown, labeling natural bodily functions as threats while scrambling to control what they couldn't understand. So the next time you reach for a tissue mid-sermon, take comfort knowing your sneeze won't end with a penance, unless, of course, your pastor happens to be a medieval history buff. The toll of the curfew bell wasn't just a suggestion. It was a command that froze entire towns in their tracks. When that deep, resonant chime echoed through the streets after dark, windows shuttered, doors bolted, and anyone still outside had minutes to prove they had legitimate business or face the consequences. Valid reasons, delivering a baby, fetching a doctor, or perhaps rushing to extinguish a fire, anything less could mean a night in the stocks or worse. This wasn't just about crime prevention, it was about power. Authorities argued that curfews kept people safe from thieves and wolves, but the unspoken truth was far more controlling. By locking the populace indoors, rulers could suppress gatherings, monitor dissent, and ensure no one plotted under cover of darkness. For ordinary people, the curfew bell dictated life's rhythm. Miss its final toll while visiting a neighbor, and you'd be stranded until dawn unless you fancied a run-in with the night watch. These enforcers patrolled with lanterns and pikes, questioning anyone bold enough to linger. Wealthy merchants might bribe their way home, but peasants caught without excuse faced public humiliation, forced to stand in the square with a placard detailing their crime, or even whipped as a warning to others. And the restrictions didn't end at curfew. Some towns required residents to hang lanterns outside their homes after dark, turning entire streets into glowing grids so watchmen could spot movement easily. Yet the most fascinating twist, the bell's reach extended beyond people. In places like London, even taverns had to douse their fires and stop serving when curfew rang, cutting off social life at its roots. No late-night ale, no whispered conversations by the hearth, just silence. Compare that to today's relaxed curfews, where teens might grumble about being home by midnight, and it's clear how much freedom we've gained. But medieval life wasn't all restriction. Some towns had lawless hours before dawn when markets could prepare, creating a fragile balance between control and necessity. The curfew bell wasn't just a rule, it was a heartbeat pulsing through the veins of medieval society, reminding everyone who held the keys to their freedom. In medieval Europe, the simple act of selling a loaf of bread could turn a baker's life upside down if the price wasn't just right. Authorities didn't just trust bakers to set their own rates, they imposed strict price controls, dictating exactly how much a loaf could cost based on grain prices. The goal was noble: to prevent starvation and keep food affordable during famines or shortages. But the execution was ruthless. A baker accused of overcharging or selling underweight bread didn't just face a fine, they faced the pillory, a wooden contraption that locked their head and hands in place, leaving them exposed to public ridicule. Crowds would gather to hurl rotten food, insults, or worse at the trapped baker, turning a profession that fed communities into one fraught with danger. What made these laws so fascinating was their precision. In cities like London, officials used elaborate formulas to calculate the just price of bread, adjusting it weekly based on grain market fluctuations. Bakers had to post these prices publicly, and inspectors would conduct surprise weigh-ins, carrying scales to verify every loaf. Even a slight deviation, say, a loaf that was an ounce too light, could spell disaster. The reasoning: in a world where bread wasn't just a staple but often the only meal for poor families, cheating was seen as a crime against society itself. Yet the system was far from fair. Wealthy bakers with connections might escape with a warning, while small-scale bakers, struggling to afford grain during bad harvests, bore the brunt of punishment. The irony: these laws often backfired. Fear of penalties led some bakers to secretly reduce loaf sizes rather than raise prices, leaving customers with less food for their money. Others resorted to bribing inspectors, creating a shadow economy of corruption. And in extreme cases, bakers abandoned their ovens altogether, worsening shortages. This wasn't just about bread, it was a glimpse into how medieval governments tried to control scarcity through fear, revealing the fragile line between order and oppression. Today's food regulations might seem strict, but they've got nothing on the medieval world, where the price of a loaf could cost a baker their dignity or their livelihood. A pig in the dock, a swarm of locusts on trial, even a colony of ants facing charges. Welcome to the surreal world of medieval animal courtrooms. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were full-blown legal proceedings where creatures great and small were prosecuted with the same gravity as human criminals. Take the case of a sow executed in France in the 1400s after being convicted of mauling a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes for its trial, given a defense attorney, and after being found guilty, publicly hanged in the town square. But pigs weren't the only defendants. Rats gnawing through grain stores could be summoned to court, their absence interpreted as contempt. Locusts devouring crops faced excommunication by the church, with priests formally ordering them to leave parish lands, sometimes even assigning them a designated feeding ground elsewhere. What drove this bizarre legal theater? Medieval minds saw nature as deeply entwined with divine justice. Animals weren't just pests, they were moral actors capable of sin. A pig attacking a child wasn't merely instinct, it was rebellion against God's order. Trials became a way to restore cosmic balance, using human laws to correct nature's perceived transgressions. The rituals were meticulous. Animals had the right to counsel, though their lawyers often argued the creatures were ignorant of human laws rather than innocent. Witnesses testified, judges deliberated, and sentences ranged from banishment to execution. In one famous case, a donkey accused of bestiality was acquitted, not because it didn't happen, but because the court deemed the animal a victim of human coercion. The trials also exposed society's fears. Rats and insects weren't just nuisances, they threatened survival during famines. Prosecuting them was a desperate attempt to assert control over forces that defied human power. And while nobles might laugh at a peasant's lawsuit against weevils, the underlying terror was real. If nature could rebel, what else might go wrong? Today, we'd call it superstition, but for medieval people, it was just as flawed, theatrical, and utterly earnest. Next time your dog chews a shoe, be grateful the worst it faces is a scolding, not a subpoena. In medieval Europe, the color of your cloak could land you in deeper trouble than stealing a loaf of bread. Sumptuary laws weren't just about fashion. They were a rigid social ladder stitched into the very fabric of daily life. Picture a peasant saving for years to buy a single bolt of silk, only to have it ripped from their hands by authorities because their birthright didn't include the privilege of wearing it. These laws spelled out exactly who could wear what, down to the thread count. Purple, dyed from rare sea snails and worth its weight in gold, was reserved for royalty alone. A merchant daring to don a violet tunic might lose not just the garment but a month's earnings in fines. Even stripes or embroidery could mark someone as getting above themselves, inviting punishment meant to keep the social order intact. But why such obsession with wardrobe control? It wasn't just about envy, it was about power. In a world where a king's authority depended on visible displays of superiority, letting a farmer's wife wear silver-threaded sleeves blurred the lines too dangerously. Nobles argued these laws prevented wasteful spending by commoners, but the real fear was imitation. If a wealthy trader dressed like a duke, how would anyone know whom to bow to? The laws exposed a paradox. While medieval societies preached divine order, they didn't trust that order to maintain itself without legal threats. Enforcement was as creative as it was cruel. In Florence, fashion police patrolled markets, inspecting hemlines and fabric types. Violators might be paraded through town wearing a symbolic yoke or forced to donate the offending garment to the church. Some cities required tailors to swear oaths not to sew illegal clothing, turning craftsmen into unwitting enforcers. Yet resistance simmered. Clever loopholes emerged, commoners lining cloaks with forbidden silks, hidden from view but known to the wearer. Others dyed wool with cheaper pigments to mimic elite hues, playing a dangerous game of sartorial deception. The legacy of these laws lingers in unexpected ways. While modern fashion is mostly free from legal restrictions, the idea of clothing as a status symbol hasn't faded. It's just shifted from royal decrees to designer labels. But next time you slip into a favorite outfit without a second thought, spare a thought for medieval souls who risked ruin for the crime of wearing the wrong shade of blue. Thirsty for innovation, in 16th century Germany, you'd have found your options brutally limited, not by taste but by law. The Rhinehatesjibat, or beer purity law of 1516, wasn't just a regulation. It was a cultural earthquake that reshaped brewing for centuries. Under this decree, beer could legally contain only 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. Yeast, that magical microbe essential for fermentation, wasn't even mentioned, not because it was banned, but because medieval brewers didn't yet understand its role. They simply reused sediment from previous batches, unknowingly harnessing nature's alchemy. But woe to the brewer who dared add a pinch of spice or a handful of fruit to their vats. Getting caught meant more than a slap on the wrist. It could mean the destruction of your entire stock, your barrels smashed open in the street as a warning to others. At first glance, the law seemed noble, a way to protect consumers from shady brewers padding their beer with cheap fillers like sawdust or poisonous herbs. After all, in an era without refrigeration or modern sanitation, a spoiled batch could sicken entire villages. But the Rhinehatesjibat had a darker edge. It was economic warfare disguised as quality control. By banning wheat, Bavarian dukes ensured bakers, not brewers, had first claim on precious grain during famines. It also crushed competition from neighboring regions famous for their wheat beers, funneling profits back to local barley growers. For ordinary drinkers, the law meant monotony. Imagine traveling across Germany and finding every tavern serving nearly identical brews with only slight variations in bitterness or strength. No rich porters, no tart cherry ales, just a sea of barley-based sameness. Yet human ingenuity thrives under restriction. Some brewers secretly experimented with illicit ingredients, hiding their creations in cellars or selling them under the counter. Others exploited loopholes like labeling spiced beers as medicinal tonics to avoid scrutiny. Over time, the law's grip loosened. When scientists discovered yeast's role in fermentation, it was quietly added to the official list in the 1800s. Modern craft brewers now view the Rhinehatesjibat with mixed feelings. It's a badge of tradition for some, a straitjacket for others. Today's beer lovers sipping a pumpkin ale or chocolate stout, oh no, thanks to medieval legislators. They're tasting the victory of creativity over control, one rebellious sip at a time. Chessboards hidden under beds, knights and pawns smuggled in grain sacks. This was the reality for players in medieval Europe when the game became a criminal act. Authorities didn't just frown upon chess, they saw it as a direct threat to public order. In 11th century France, King Louis IX famously outlawed it, calling it frivolous and morally corrosive. While in England, church leaders warned that the game's strategic battles could stir real-world violence. The penalties were no joke. A noble caught playing might face a hefty fine, but a commoner could end up in the stocks, their board burned in front of them as a lesson. What made a game of black and white squares so dangerous? For one, chess was often tangled with gambling. Soldiers would wager their armor or months' pay on matches, turning quiet strategy into raucous, debt-fueled brawls. But the deeper fear was distraction. Military leaders complained that troops spent more time plotting checkmates than practicing sword drills. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell on battlefield skill, chess seemed like a reckless diversion. Even worse, the game's origins in the Muslim world made it suspect to Christian authorities, who viewed its intricate rules as a potential gateway to foreign ideas. Yet the ban revealed a curious hypocrisy. While commoners faced punishment, nobles often played in private, treating chess as a mark of sophistication. Some rulers, like Alfonso X of Castile, even commissioned lavish sets while publicly condemning the game. Underground chess clubs flourished, with players developing coded language to discuss moves without arousing suspicion. Tavern owners would hide boards under false tabletops, flipping them over only for trusted patrons. The irony, chess survived not despite these crackdowns, but because of them. The thrill of forbidden play only deepened its allure, transforming it from a pastime into a symbol of rebellion. Today's chess grandmasters owe their fame to centuries of players who refused to let kings dictate which moves were legal, both on and off the board. Grief had a volume limit in medieval Europe, and exceeding it could cost you more than just social discomfort. In towns across England and France, laws forbade excessive mourning, a vague term that covered everything from loud wailing to tearing one's clothing in public. The penalties were shockingly practical. A widow sobbing too dramatically at her husband's funeral might be fined a week's wages, while a group of mourners chanting dirges after sunset could face jail time for disturbing the night's peace. At first glance, this seems heartless, but the reasoning was oddly bureaucratic. Town councils argued unchecked grief spread panic, especially during plagues when constant screams might make residents flee, worsening outbreaks. There was also a financial angle. Professional mourners paid to amplify sorrow at funerals were seen as exploiting emotions for profit, twisting private loss into public spectacle. Yet these laws revealed a deeper tension between control and humanity. Medieval societies prized order, but death was chaos incarnate, something no statute could fully tame. For the bereaved, navigating these rules meant grieving in code. Women might clutch handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to induce silent tears, while men developed rigid funeral protocols, measured steps, hushed words, to convey sorrow without crossing legal lines. Some communities devised loopholes like hiring approved mourners, whose volume was pre-regulated by the church. Others turned to subversive symbols, wearing black for years instead of weeping, or planting rosemary on graves, a herb linked to remembrance as a quiet rebellion against emotional suppression. The most heartbreaking twist, these laws often targeted the poor. Nobles could mourn extravagantly behind castle walls, but peasants grieving in cramped streets had no such privacy. A duke's widow might unleash her sorrow unchecked, while a baker's wife had to swallow hers, a stark reminder that even tears were policed by class. Today, we take emotional expression for granted, but these medieval edicts linger in subtle ways. Ever been told to keep it down at a funeral? That's the echo of a world where grief had to fit inside society's narrow rules, proving that some silences are centuries in the making. A dog in a velvet coat wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a legal requirement in cities like 14th century Nuremberg, where pets had to dress according to their owner's social standing. Imagine a merchant's terrier strutting through the market in a linen vest, only to be seized by authorities because the fabric's weave was too fine for its station. This wasn't canine vanity. It was societal control taken to absurd extremes. The reasoning: medieval elites believed that if even animals blurred class lines, the entire social order could unravel. A peasant's hound wearing a silk ribbon wasn't just breaking dress codes, it was committing a kind of furry treason. But clothing was just the start. Some towns demanded that dogs of different ranks wear specific colored leashes: scarlet for nobility, plain hemp for commoners, so their status was visible at a glance. In Venice, lapdogs carried by wealthy ladies had to be licensed like tiny, furry aristocrats, with tax payments to match. Unregistered pets could be confiscated and exiled to the city outskirts, a humiliating fate for creatures bred for pampering. Meanwhile, hunting dogs fell under even stricter rules. In England, only landowners with estates above a certain size could own greyhounds, a law designed to prevent peasants from poaching game reserved for the crown. Getting caught with an illegal hound meant not just losing the dog, but facing a punishment akin to theft, flogging, fines, or even time in the stocks. The most bizarre twist: some laws extended beyond dogs. In Switzerland, cats roaming at night without a bell to warn birds of their presence could be fined. Yes, fined by local courts. Owners had to pay up or risk their feline being arrested and held until the fee was settled. Birds weren't spared either. Falcons used for hunting required royal permits, and flying one without papers could land you in prison faster than the bird itself could dive for prey. These rules weren't just about animals, they were about power. By regulating pets, medieval authorities reinforced the idea that every living thing, down to the lowliest mutt, had a place in the hierarchy. A noble spaniel dining on scraps from the high table wasn't just spoiled. It was performing a political act, a living symbol of its owner's privilege. Today, we might chuckle at the thought of dressing a chihuahua in a mini doublet, but the impulse behind it, using visible markers to enforce social division, still lingers. After all, isn't a designer dog carrier just the modern version of a velvet canine collar? The materials have changed, but the message remains the same. Even our pets can't escape the weight of status. Whistling on a medieval ship wasn't just annoying. It was a crime punishable by being tossed into the waves. Sailors believed the sharp, airy notes of a whistle could mimic the sound of rising winds, literally calling storms into existence. This wasn't a minor superstition. It was ironclad law in ports from England to the Mediterranean. Crews took it so seriously that even an absent-minded tune hummed between tasks could earn a sailor a night in the bilge or worse, a dunk in the ocean to wash away the bad luck they'd invited. The rule wasn't just about noise, it was about survival. In an era when ships vanished without a trace, sailors clung to rituals that offered the illusion of control over the unpredictable sea. The irony, whistling was often the one sound sailors desperately wanted to hear, but only from the wind itself. Without modern navigation, ships relied on favorable breezes, and a crew might spend weeks stranded in calm waters, praying for any sign of movement. Yet human-made whistles were forbidden, as if the sea might confuse them for the real thing and respond with fury. This paradox reveals the medieval mariner's tangled relationship with nature, simultaneously begging for wind's mercy and terrified of provoking its wrath. Some captains enforced the ban with theatrical flair, staging mock trials for offenders where the jury was a bucket of seawater. Others turned it into a rite of passage. New crew members were warned about the whistling law through grim tales of ships lost to those who ignored it. But the fear wasn't entirely irrational. Whistles carried practical risks too. In the dense fog of the North Atlantic, a sharp whistle could mask crucial sounds like breaking waves or distant bells from other ships. On pirate-haunted routes, it might accidentally signal rivals. Over time, the rule seeped into maritime culture beyond the Middle Ages, evolving into traditions like sailors whistling only during specific tasks or in designated areas of the ship. Even today, some naval crews retain a shadow of the old superstition, not because they believe in storm summoning, but as a nod to the generations who sailed before them, for whom the line between caution and magic was vanishingly thin. So next time you're tempted to whistle on a boat, remember, you're not just breaking a modern etiquette rule, you're brushing up against a 1,000-year-old fear of the sea's capricious will. Sunday afternoons in medieval England weren't for rest, they were for war preparation, and every able-bodied man knew it. The law was brutally simple. Skip your weekly archery practice, and you'd face fines that could drain a peasant's savings or even land you in the stocks. Authorities didn't just encourage archery, they demanded it, turning village greens into makeshift training grounds where the twang of bowstrings echoed like clockwork. This wasn't some quaint tradition, it was military strategy written into the fabric of daily life. After the devastating losses to English longbowmen at battles like Crecy and Agincourt, the Crown realized their greatest weapon wasn't just the yew-wood bows themselves, but the thousands of men who could use them with lethal precision. The training requirements were shockingly rigorous. By law, men aged 7 to 60 had to practice at least 2 hours every Sunday after church, shooting arrows at targets set precisely 220 yards away, the standard battlefield range. Towns kept communal stocks of bows and arrows, and fathers were expected to drill their sons as soon as they could hold a miniature bow. Local officials conducted surprise inspections, testing skills with brutal efficiency. Fail to hit the mark, that might mean extra drills under the watchful eye of a retired soldier. Refuse outright, you'd be hauled before the magistrate faster than an arrow could fly. But the genius of this system lay in its subtlety. By embedding martial skill into weekly routines, England created a standing army without the cost of maintaining one. Farmers, blacksmiths, and cobblers might seem like ordinary civilians, but with a longbow in hand, they transformed into a force that could decimate charging knights. The law even banned other sports like football on Sundays, ensuring no distractions from archery, a move that sparked grumbling but guaranteed compliance. The penalties revealed just how seriously this was taken. In some villages, chronic skippers had their homes' doors removed for a month, a humiliating and impractical punishment. Wealthier offenders might forfeit livestock, while repeat resistors could find themselves conscripted into frontline units as volunteers. Yet for all its harshness, the system worked. When war erupted, England could summon tens of thousands of archers with muscle memory honed over a lifetime of Sundays. What's often overlooked is how this law reshaped society. Archery became the great equalizer, a rare skill where a peasant's son might outshoot a noble's. Some villages held competitions where the best marksmen earned tax breaks, turning practice into a path to prestige. The longbow's dominance eventually faded with gunpowder, but for centuries, this simple mandate kept England safe by turning everyday life into covert military training. Today's gym goers might complain about leg day, but imagine if skipping your workout meant answering to the king's army. Suddenly, that treadmill doesn't seem so intimidating. A knight's flowing locks could cost him more than just his dignity. They might strip him of his freedom. In 12th century England, King Henry I issued a decree that sent shockwaves through his court. Men were forbidden from wearing their hair long, with violators subject to public shearing or crippling fines. This wasn't about grooming standards, it was a calculated power play. Henry, freshly crowned after his brother's mysterious death in a hunting accident, saw long hair as a symbol of rebellion, a style favored by his predecessor's loyalists. By forcing noblemen to crop their tresses, he wasn't just tidying up appearances, he was snipping away visible ties to the old regime, one haircut at a time. The enforcement was as humiliating as it was effective. Royal barbers patrolled taverns and market squares, armed with scissors and royal authority. Resisting a trim could mean imprisonment, while those who complied faced a different kind of punishment, walking home with hastily butchered haircuts that left them the laughingstock of their peers. The message was clear: even your reflection belonged to the crown. But why such obsession over a few inches of hair? Medieval rulers understood something modern politicians still grasp: appearance is political. Long hair, often associated with knights and warriors, carried an air of independence, suggesting a man answered to no one but himself. In a world where loyalty was fragile, kings couldn't afford such ambiguity. The backlash was swift and revealing. Some nobles openly defied the edict, wearing their hair long as a silent protest, while others adopted elaborate hoods to conceal their forbidden manes. The clergy, never ones to miss an opportunity, declared short hair godly, framing obedience as piety. Meanwhile, commoners found themselves caught in the crossfire. A peasant with shoulder-length hair might escape notice unless a local official needed to fill quota fines, turning personal style into a revenue stream. This wasn't just an English quirk. In Byzantium, Emperor Basil II mandated short hair for soldiers to prevent enemies from grabbing it in battle, a practical rule that morphed into a broader fashion decree. Even Vikings, often romanticized for their wild locks, had strict hair codes. Thralls' slaves were forbidden from wearing their hair like free men, turning hairstyles into a walking caste system. The echoes of these laws linger. From military buzz cuts to corporate dress codes, societies still use hair to enforce conformity. The difference: today's penalties might be a disapproving glance or a missed promotion, not a royal barber lying in wait. Yet the underlying tension remains. How much of your appearance is truly yours, and how much is dictated by the invisible scissors of power? Henry's edict may have faded, but its shadow still falls across every mirror. Walking through a medieval marketplace, the scent of fresh bread and spices might have mingled with something far less pleasant: the stench of rancid meat dangling from a butcher's neck as he sat trapped in the stocks. This wasn't just punishment, it was dinner theater with a moral lesson. Authorities didn't just fine dishonest butchers, they turned their crimes into public spectacles. binding the rotten cuts they'd tried to sell around their throats like grotesque necklaces. Crowds would gather to jeer, pelting the offender with rotten vegetables or dung, while the meat, now buzzing with flies, served as a visceral warning to others. The message was clear: cheat your customers and you'd wear your shame literally. But why such theatrical cruelty? In an era without refrigeration or health inspectors, spoiled meat wasn't just a nuisance, it could kill. A single tainted sausage might wipe out a family, and with no way to trace outbreaks, prevention relied on fear. The stocks weren't just about humiliation, they were a crude form of consumer protection. Victims of food poisoning could point to the punished butcher and feel justice had been served, even as the spectacle deterred others from risking the same fate. The law also exposed a dark truth about medieval economics. Poor butchers, desperate to avoid losing inventory, were often the ones gambling with marginally spoiled cuts, while wealthy merchants could afford to discard questionable stock. The practice revealed society's twisted relationship with food and fairness. Some towns took it further, forcing offenders to eat the rotten meat, a punishment that could prove fatal. Others required butchers to swear oaths on religious relics, blending divine judgment with earthly law. Yet for all its brutality, the system had unintended consequences. Fear of punishment led some butchers to oversalt or smoke meat to mask spoilage, creating new health risks. And while nobles might buy freshly slaughtered game, the poor often had no choice but to trust vendors who'd already been caught cheating, just with better hidden tactics. What's most striking is how these punishments mirrored the crimes. Just as bad meat poisoned bodies, public shaming poisoned reputations, leaving scars no fine could erase. Today's food safety laws rely on recalls and fines, but the medieval approach, for all its cruelty, ensured no one forgot the cost of fraud. Next time you check a grocery store expiration date, remember, it's a privilege bought centuries ago by butchers who paid for their lies in rot and ridicule. Twirling in a village square could cost you more than just your breath. It might cost you your soul, at least according to medieval religious authorities who saw dancing as a direct path to damnation. In regions like 12th century France and parts of Germany, bans on dancing weren't just occasional crackdowns, they were ironclad laws enforced with terrifying zeal. Church leaders argued that the sway of hips and the tapping of feet weren't innocent pleasures but gateways to lust, drunkenness, and even witchcraft. A single festive gathering could spiral into chaos, they claimed, with dancers abandoning piety for debauchery under the moon's seductive glow. The penalties were severe: excommunication for repeat offenders, hefty fines for first-time violators, and in some cases, public whippings to beat the sin out of the disobedient. But why target something as universal as dance? The answer lies in the medieval church's obsession with control over bodies, time, and even joy. Dancing often happened during pagan festivals or seasonal celebrations that predated Christianity, making it a threat to religious authority. When peasants danced around maypoles or stamped out traditional folk steps, they weren't just moving, they were preserving rituals that challenged the church's monopoly on community life. Worse still, dancing blurred social boundaries. Nobles and commoners might mix freely in the dance circle, their hierarchies momentarily forgotten, a notion that terrified the elite. Enforcement took creative, often cruel forms. In some towns, priests stationed spies at weddings to report anyone who dared to jig. Others employed moral patrols that barged into taverns, scattering dancers with threats of eternal fire. One record from England describes a group of women fined for leaping and cavorting at a funeral, their grief deemed too exuberant for holy ground. Yet the ban sparked equally creative resistance. Communities held silent dances, where participants moved without music to avoid detection, or disguised their gatherings as walking meetings until the coast was clear. The irony, even as the church condemned dancing, it couldn't stamp out the human need for rhythm. Some clergy quietly admitted that controlled, modest dances might be tolerable, as long as they happened under watchful eyes and with approved steps. By the late Middle Ages, the line between sin and sacrament blurred further, with liturgical dances appearing in certain cathedrals, their choreography stiff but their purpose clear, to channel joy into worship. What makes these laws so haunting is their legacy. Today's dance floors are free from inquisitors, but the idea that movement must be policed lingers, from Victorian waltz scandals to modern debates over appropriate dancing in schools. The medieval war on dance wasn't just about steps, it was about who gets to decide how bodies express happiness. So next time you lose yourself in music, remember that freedom was won by centuries of rebellious feet refusing to stand still. A rooster's dawn chorus wasn't just nature's alarm clock. It was a legal offense in many medieval towns where excessive animal noise could drain a farmer's pockets faster than a fox in the henhouse. Imagine rising before sunrise to tend your fields, only to find a town official at your door, demanding payment because your rooster dared to crow before the church bells tolled. This wasn't just about sleep deprivation. It was a clash between rural rhythms and urban control, where the natural world collided with human-imposed order in the most absurd ways. The laws varied wildly from place to place. In German towns like Nuremberg, roosters were forbidden from crowing before 4 in the morning, while Italian city-states fined owners of dogs that barked after curfew. Even cows weren't safe. A herd lowing too loudly during market hours could land their owner in hot water. Enforcement was as creative as it was ruthless. Some towns employed noise wardens who patrolled with hourglasses, noting which farms disrupted the peace. Others relied on neighbors to report offenders, turning quiet nights into a web of grudges and payback. But beneath the surface, these ordinances revealed a deeper tension. Medieval towns were caught between two worlds: the agricultural majority, whose lives revolved around animals, and the growing urban elite, who wanted streets as orderly as their ledgers. A blacksmith might tolerate his neighbor's chickens, but a wealthy merchant paying premium rents saw them as nuisances, symbols of the countryside encroaching on his refined existence. The laws became a tool for social sorting, with fines disproportionately targeting small-scale farmers, while monasteries with sprawling estates often got exemptions. The punishments were anything but trivial. Repeat offenders might have their animals confiscated and sold at auction, a devastating blow for families relying on a single cow or flock of geese. In extreme cases, noisy livestock could be exiled beyond city walls, forcing owners into costly daily treks to tend them. Some communities took a darker turn, requiring farmers to muzzle their dogs or keep roosters in darkened coops to delay their crowing, a cruelty disguised as compliance. Yet the laws also sparked ingenious workarounds. Farmers near Paris discovered that feeding roosters later in the evening delayed their morning songs, while others trained dogs to bark only on command. One record from England describes a cunning shepherd who taught his flock to follow a silent hand signal, avoiding the bells that typically drew fines. These small rebellions highlight a truth the lawmakers overlooked: you can't legislate nature without consequences. What's most striking is how these rules echo today. Modern noise complaints about barking dogs or leaf blowers are just gentler versions of the same battle, where one person's livelihood is another's disruption. The difference: medieval farmers didn't get a warning letter. They got a fine, a confiscation, or worse, a lesson in who really controlled the rhythms of their world. So next time you're jolted awake by a pre-dawn rooster, remember, 700 years ago, someone might have dragged that bird to court. Some arguments, it seems, are timeless. The so-called right of the first night stands as one of the most disturbing legends and possibly realities of medieval Europe. Lords across the continent were said to claim the privilege of spending a bride's wedding night with her before her husband could, turning marriage into a grotesque power play. Historical records on the practice, known as droit du seigneur or jus primi noctis, are frustratingly murky. Some scholars argue it was pure myth, exaggerated by later writers to make the Middle Ages seem barbaric. Others point to scattered legal texts and village rumors as proof it happened in certain regions, if not as an official law, then as an unchecked abuse of feudal power. What's undeniable is how deeply this idea, real or imagined, terrified medieval peasants. Imagine a young couple having scraped together coins for a wedding feast, facing the unthinkable, the local lord arriving to enforce his right. Resistance could mean eviction, violence, or worse. Some villages developed desperate strategies to avoid it, like holding secret midnight weddings or paying the lord a tax to leave the bride untouched. The psychological toll was crushing. Even if the practice was rare, the fear of it shaped relationships, turning what should have been joyous unions into moments of dread. The symbolism cuts deeper than any single act. This wasn't just about sex, it was about domination. By inserting himself into the most intimate moment of a peasant's life, a lord wasn't just taking a night, he was erasing boundaries, proving his control extended even into the marriage bed. No law code needed to spell it out for the message to be clear. Your body, your family, your future weren't truly yours, yet the debate among historians reveals another layer. Some argue that references to the first night in medieval documents were actually about taxes, a fee paid to the lord for permission to marry, twisted over time into something darker. Others note that the earliest surviving mentions come from satires or anti-feudal propaganda, like 16th century texts mocking noble excess. But whether factual or folklore, the persistence of this idea speaks volumes. Even as a myth, it exposed the raw nerve of feudal life, the helplessness of those at the bottom, and the casual cruelty of those at the top. The legacy lingers in unsettling ways. Modern phrases like "the honeymoon is over" may trace back to these practices, a linguistic ghost of brides who vanished for a night. And while we'll never know how many suffered under this law, its shadow reminds us how easily power can corrupt, and how often history's darkest chapters hide between the lines of what was written and what was whispered. Opening an umbrella in medieval Europe wasn't just a way to stay dry. It was an act of defiance against the heavens. Church leaders saw these early rain shields as arrogant attempts to interfere with divine will, asking why anyone would dare obstruct the very weather God had chosen to send. A merchant strolling through the streets of 14th century Florence with a waxed canvas parasol might find himself pelted with rotten fruit or dragged before a magistrate, his practical accessory treated like a blasphemous artifact. The reasoning was as simple as it was rigid. Rain was a blessing, a test, or sometimes a punishment, and to avoid it was to reject God's plan. But this wasn't just about theology, it was about class. Umbrellas, borrowed from Middle Eastern and Asian traders, were initially luxuries only the wealthy could afford. When commoners began crafting homemade versions from oiled cloth and wooden frames, elites suddenly declared them sinful, revealing how quickly practicality could become politicized. The backlash was fierce. In some German towns, umbrella users were forced to donate their devices to the church, where priests would ceremonially puncture them to release the trapped rain back to the skies. French markets posted signs warning that carrying one during storms would incur fines double the cost of the umbrella itself, a penalty designed to crush both the object and the impulse behind it. The irony: medieval society had no problem with other forms of shelter. Cloaks, hoods, and even covered walkways were perfectly acceptable apparently. God only took offense if the protection was handheld. This hypocrisy exposed the law's true purpose: control over innovation. By banning umbrellas, authorities weren't just policing piety, they were stifling a symbol of independence. A peasant with an umbrella could work through a downpour, untethered from the need to seek refuge in church porches or noble-owned arcades. That kind of self-sufficiency threatened the social order, where even the weather was meant to remind people of their dependence on higher powers. Yet human ingenuity couldn't be suppressed forever. Canny umbrella enthusiasts found loopholes, calling their devices portable awnings or using them discreetly in alleyways. By the Renaissance, the bans began to crumble as trade with Asia introduced sturdier designs even bishops couldn't ignore. What began as heresy became haute couture, with Venetian nobles parading gilded parasols as status symbols, proof that not even divine disapproval could hold back progress. Today's umbrella-toting city dwellers might grumble about forgotten raincoats, but they're walking testaments to a time when keeping dry was a quiet act of rebellion. Missing Sunday Mass in medieval Europe wasn't just a personal choice. It was a crime with consequences that could unravel your life. Across England, France, and beyond, laws required every able-bodied citizen to attend church services, with town officials taking roll calls and noting empty pews like grim schoolmasters. First-time offenders might escape with a warning, but repeat absentees faced escalating punishments. Fines that could consume a week's wages, public shaming in the stocks, or even imprisonment for those deemed habitually negligent. This wasn't merely about piety, it was about power. The church didn't just guide souls, it governed them, with attendance records doubling as civic registries and sermons serving as official proclamations. The enforcement methods were as inventive as they were intimidating. Some parishes employed pew watchers, zealous congregants tasked with memorizing faces and reporting missing neighbors. Others used communal pressure, ringing special bells before services that alerted the entire village to stragglers still in their homes. In tight-knit communities, skipping church wasn't just illegal, it was social suicide, marking you as an outsider or worse, a heretic. Wealthy families could sometimes buy their way out by donating to church repairs, but peasants had no such luxury. A farmer nursing a sick child or tending a birthing animal might still face penalties, proving the law cared little for practical excuses. Beneath the surface, these mandates reveal a world where spiritual and earthly authority were inseparable. Kings and bishops ruled in tandem, with Sunday attendance serving as both religious duty and loyalty test. During political unrest, empty pews could signal rebellion, prompting investigations into entire families. The law also functioned as early surveillance. By forcing everyone into one building weekly, authorities could monitor movements, spread propaganda, and identify dissenters. Yet resistance simmered in clever forms. Some villagers perfected the art of the church dash, slipping in just long enough to be marked present before vanishing to tend fields. Others exploited loopholes, like attending obscure dawn services that lacked oversight. The most defiant retreated to secret forest clearings for underground worship, risking everything for a few hours of spiritual freedom. The legacy of these laws lingers in subtle ways. Modern debates about compulsory voting or jury duty echo the same tension. How much personal freedom should a society sacrifice for collective order? But next time you hit snooze instead of heading to a weekend service, remember 7 centuries ago, That simple act could have cost you more than just sleep. Picture stepping into a 14th century cobblestone street and spotting a man hobbling in shoes so extravagantly pointed they curled upward like scorpion tails. These weren't just footwear, they were declarations of vanity so extreme, authorities across Europe declared war on them. From London to Krakow, sumptuary laws took aim at poulaines, those absurdly elongated shoes favored by nobles and wealthy merchants. The reasoning, their excessive length wasn't just impractical, it was downright sinful. Church leaders claimed the shoes' phallic shapes promoted lust, while town councils argued their exaggerated designs wasted good leather that could outfit a dozen sensible shoes. But this wasn't just about morality or materials, it was about power. When commoners started wearing scaled-down versions, elites panicked. If a cobbler's apprentice could mimic a lord's fashion, how would anyone know their place? The crackdown was swift and severe. In London, officers patrolled markets with iron measuring rods, confiscating any shoe with a toe extending beyond 2 inches, roughly the length of a man's thumb, hence the term thumb's breadth law. Repeat offenders faced crippling fines or had their workshops shuttered. Paris took it further, requiring shoemakers to swear oaths not to craft the forbidden style, with violations punishable by public flogging. Some towns even employed shoe spies, informants who earned rewards for reporting neighbors sporting illegal footwear. The most dramatic enforcement came from Venice, where authorities burned confiscated poulaines in the Piazza San Marco, turning fashion into fuel for a very public moral lesson. Yet the ban revealed a delicious irony. While clergy condemned the shoes as indecent, medieval artwork shows bishops and abbots sporting discreetly pointed footwear themselves proof that hypocrisy stretched as far as the toes they pretended to disdain. Meanwhile, the wealthy flouted laws by adding detachable tips, slipping them on after passing inspectors. Others commissioned shoes with hollow points to hide smuggled jewels or even small blades, transforming fashion into covert utility. What makes this more than a quirky footnote is how familiar it feels. Replace pointy shoes with ripped jeans, sagging pants, or even certain hairstyles, and you've got the same pattern, those in power dictating what bodies can wear to maintain control. The poulaine panic wasn't really about shoes, it was about the fear that when everyone looks the same, no one knows their rank. 7 centuries later, dress codes still police everything from boardrooms to schools, proving that while the styles change, the struggle over who gets to wear what never really ends. From forks to footwear, these 20 bizarre laws peel back the curtain on a medieval world where nothing, not a sneeze, a loaf of bread, or even a rooster's crow was too small to regulate. What seems absurd today was deadly serious back then, a tool to maintain order, reinforce power, and sometimes to mask the insecurities of those in charge. Some of these rules make us chuckle, like the idea that whistling could summon a storm or that chess was too dangerous for public play. Others, like the grim specter of the so-called first night, or the brutal punishments for mourning too loudly, leave a darker stain, reminders of how easily authority could tip into cruelty. But these laws weren't just about control, they were mirrors reflecting medieval society's deepest fears and priorities. A sumptuary law dictating the color of your cloak wasn't just fashion policing, it was a desperate attempt to freeze social mobility in place. The ban on forks, a clash between tradition and progress, where even utensils could threaten the cosmic order. And let's not forget the poor bakers, whose livelihoods hung on the weight of a single loaf, proving that fairness often took a backseat to fear. What's fascinating is how many of these ideas still echo today. We might not put pigs on trial anymore, but modern debates about dress codes, noise complaints, or even food safety regulations show how societies still struggle to balance freedom and control. The difference: today's consequences are usually fines or stern letters, not public shaming with rotten meat around your neck. So which law shocked you the most? Was it the sheer pettiness of outlawing umbrellas or the chilling logic behind silencing grief? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which of these medieval rules made you gasp, laugh, or shake your head in disbelief. If you enjoyed this trip through history's strangest legal codes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into the past. After all, history isn't just about kings and conquests. It's about the everyday absurdities that remind us how far we've come and how human nature stays stubbornly, wonderfully the same. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next time you reach for a fork or lace up your shoes, you're stepping into a story centuries in the making.